So we just finished actually 14b, and we'll just go over the last Gemara that we learned. Um, and and then maybe we'll even start the Mishnah on 15a. So the Gemara that we learned was dealing with this machlokes that we've been talking about for a few days already, Rav and Shmuel, and we have a brisa that follows Rav and a brisa that follows Shmuel. And the rise of follow Shmuel it's a little complicated the way it concludes because it talks about Moide Reb Meir. Reb Meir agrees, and Moide Reb Yehuda agrees or admits. And the thing is, this Bryce is really going to be discussed at more length later on. So instead of going into it now, I think it's better if we wait till we reach page Daf Yud Ches, where Yud Zion Yud Ches that talks about it more, and then maybe we could even go back and look at it again. But the wording of the brisa is that Reb Meir agrees if there is space in between these boards, the same size of a board, that all you need to do is put kosher schach there. And if you put kosher schach there in between each of the boards, then it'll be kosher. So seemingly what the point, I mean, what is Reb Meir, what point is Reb Meir making, that if you have space in between, that it'll be kosher, is basically saying the law of Dofen Akuma. It seems that which basically means that the sides of the schach have some non-kosher stuff in them, but it's okay because we're looking at it as a wall. We're not looking at it as a schach. And the middle part of the schach, that's really what we're using. We're considering schach. So Reb Meir agrees that even though you can't use these beams, nevertheless you could use them for a wall. You can't use these beams for schach, for handrests. So the thing is, even Reb Yehuda agrees with that. So what exactly is he agreeing? Moed Reb Meir is agreeing, seemingly to Reb Yehuda, that in this case the sukkah will be kosher, even though I normally prohibit for hand breadths beam boards, but nevertheless here I'm going to permit it. I mean, even Reb Yehuda basically agrees to such a thing, and then the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda agrees. What does Rabbi Yehuda agree to? That if you put on it a neser, which is 4 tfachim, if you have a 4 hand breadth a board, that it is kosher, but you can't sleep under it. So he agrees that you're not allowed to sleep under this 4 hand breadth board. And if a person does sleep under it, he won't be it won't be valid. So even though if it's less than 4 hand breadths, that in Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, if it would be less than 4 hand breadths, what does Rabbi Yehuda hold? Let's think about that. The argument of Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda is between 3 and 4. So Reb Yehuda would say it's kosher schach. So even though he allows you to, so obviously you could sleep under it. So if it's less than 4 hand breadths and you could sleep under it, that's Reb Yehuda's general view. But if it's more than 4 hand breadths, then he agrees to Reb Meir that you're not going to be allowed to sleep under. He agrees that if it's 4 hand breadths, so the sukkah is kosher. The sukkah could be permissible, but nevertheless, you can't sleep under that board. That's a 4 hand breadth board. And now, what is the case talking about? The case would have to be talking about that it's on the side. It's in the middle of the sukkah. It's going to be a problem. It'll mess up your whole sukkah. But if it's on the side of the sukkah, so he agrees. the problem, the reason, the complication that I see from this statement in the Brisa is like, what is Rabbi Yehuda really adding? Isn't this obvious? You know, so he'll agree you can't sleep under it. Yeah, he holds that the four handbreadth board is pasul for schach. So isn't it seems pretty obvious that he would hold that way, that the board is um, would be pasul for schach. What exactly is he adding by saying that? But we're going to learn this brisa again later on. So when we learn it there, the Gemara is going to go through it, and it's going to give different examples in different cases, and we'll see there, and we'll come back to it. So the next piece of Gemara that we learned was talking about where you turn the boards on their sides. So basically, you have non-kosher boards, but instead of putting these boards flat, you put them on their sides so um, their length is, I should say, their uh, the problematic side of it that's too big is really standing upward. It's vertical. It's not horizontal. So it's very different than a tikra, than a roof. So on this, we have a debate. There's a Rav Huna who says it's invalid. And the reason why it's invalid, why would it be invalid? You have boards that they don't look like a roof. But the answer is that when the rabbis prohibited these boards that are 4 handbreadths wide, they prohibited them and said you can't use them for schach. So you want to use it on the side? It's invalid schach. Did the rabbis say that this schach is invalid? Or did the rabbis say that the way you put it on your sukkah is invalid? The way Rav Huna sees it is they said this schach is invalid. If this schach is invalid, so then it's not going to be usable for schach no matter how you put it. That's Rav Huna. Rav Chizda and Rabbi by Rav Huna, they said kosher, it's kosher. And the reason why it's kosher, obviously, is because you placed it in this way that it's very different than a roof, and because you placed it in a way that's different than a roof, it doesn't. It's really different than what the simple understanding of the case that's prohibited. This is very different. It's placed differently. It totally doesn't look the same, and so therefore, and they say it's kosher. And then we have where Rav Nachman came to Surah, or he went to Surah. And I did look it up. David was wondering about does this mean did he live in Surah? Did he travel to Surah? What was the story there? So Rav Nachman, the general understanding is that Rav Nachman in the Gemara is always Rav Nachman bar Yaakov. There's a little discussion about this, but there's room to argue, but this is a common understanding. Is Rav Nachman bar Yaakov. He was his main place was in Mechuzah, and then he became the Rosh Yeshiva in Neherdah. So he did not live in Surah. On the other hand, Rav Huna was based in Surah, and what comes out is that Rav Nachman and many other of the great rabbis, they used to go to listen to Rav Huna. They would come once in a while to hear the great Rav Huna. Even though Rav Nachman was quite a scholar, especially in monetary laws, he was well known. He was compared to Shmuel, who was also very famous for his knowledge in monetary laws. So Rav Nachman was no small person, but he go to hear from Rav Huna. Rav Huna was the older rabbi, and he would go, and they would come every so often to Rav Huna and hear Rav Huna's latest insights and so on. And so Rav Nachman, came to Surah. It's interesting that the Gemara uses the word ikla, which implies like he might not have been heading to Surah. Maybe he happened to be passing by, so he stopped in over there. The word ikla generally doesn't mean that he traveled there; it means he happened upon Surah. But anyway, so Rav Nachman was not from there, so he was traveling and went to Surah, and Rav Chisda and Rabbi Bar Rav Huna took advantage that he's there. They're going to ask Rav Nachman what he holds, and the law, the halacha that he said was psula. It is invalid. These boards that are more than 4 handbreadths, they are invalid, and they are like shpudin shel matches. So shpud is a spit. They're like spits of metal, and basically they are invalid for schach. And so Rav Nachman was following the same opinion as Rav Huna, that they're invalid. Rav Huna was like, "Why did you ask him? Didn't I tell you that you should hold this way? Didn't I tell you this is the halacha?" Rav Huna told him, and they told him, "Yeah, you didn't give us a reason." So what it sounds like is that Rav Nachman gave them an explanation. He said it's like shpudim shel matchas, and what he was explaining is that that's that the Chachamim made a decree that these are invalid schach. Not just the way you placed it is invalid, but it itself becomes invalid. So they said, you didn't give us a reason. He said, well, you didn't ask me a reason. Anyway, that's the end of that little discussion. But the question is, so what's the halacha? So the Gemara tries to prove, like Rav Huna, that Rav Huna's opinion. In the end, the Gemara says it's not really a proof because the case is a little vague. And you could explain it to mean this case, but you could also explain it to be a different type of case. What's the case? So the case is that if you have, it's a brisa that says about a sukkah that's small, and it's too small, it can't handle a person. It's not 7 handbreadths, so it's too small of a sukkah, or there's a breach in the wall, and the bottom of the wall is missing, and you could have a gedi, a kid goat could jump and go head first and easily spaciously walk into the sukkah. So that wall is not called a wall. Or if you put a board that's 4 handbreadths on the roof, all of these cases, it's invalid. And the case with the board is very interesting because it adds this line to it. It says the board, even if part of it is hanging out of the sukkah. What does that mean? Even if you only have 3 handbreadths, it doesn't say clearly what it means, I should say. Let me read the wording. It says you put a board that's 4 handbreadths, even though you only put in the sukkah 3 handbreadths worth. So there's 2 ways of understanding that. So the first way the Gemara understands it must mean that you put it on its side. So on the side, it has 3 handbreadths. So 3 handbreadths width. But the length of it, or the depth of it, is 4 handbreadths. But you didn't. So it's a 4 handbreadth board, but you didn't put the 4 handbreadths to block up space of 4 handbreadths. It's only blocking up space of 3 handbreadths because you put it on its side. So if you think of it that way, it's really the same case as the case that we're talking about. And the case we're talking about, the Hebrew of it is called Hafchan al Tzidehen. You place them, you turn them over on their side. So that's the case of these boards, that you put them on their side. So here we're talking about a similar case. You put it on its side, it's 3 handbreadths on its side. On its regular flat surface, it's really 4 handbreadths, but you put it on its side, it's only 3 handbreadths. So in that scenario, the Gemara says that it's psula, it is invalid. So it sounds like a proof to Rav Huna, right? This sounds like a good proof, because it's basically telling you that it doesn't help, even though you put it on its side, it's not going to help you. It's still going to be invalid.
Rabbi,
yeah,
I don't see the part where it's going on the side. It sounds like the board is a 4 handbreadths board, but he's only putting in 3 handbreadths of the 4. But
and
there's
where's the
no
other
side.
handbreadth?
It's on the outside. It's like extending beyond the sukkah.
Right. So the problem is, you know the answer of the Gemara, so you're taking the answer that you know already from yesterday, and you're questioning. Well, how could you even think the what's the question, right? But
Oh,
the thing is that it doesn't say clearly what the case is. It doesn't say that the third hand breath, that the fourth hand breath is outside of it. It just says that all you have uh, in the sukkah is three, which could be translated two ways. The way
actually,
the Gemara,
I was forgetting the thing from yesterday. I was just thinking as we're going along
uh,
that that's this case. I didn't remember from yesterday.
yeah. So whatever. Anyway, I don't blame you. There definitely is room to understand it that way. What I will say is when when we get up to the answer now, let's discuss it, and we'll see. Maybe
Rabbi,
that's not as simple. Maybe it's not as simple as it sounds. Maybe that shouldn't be the halacha. Should it
Rabbi,
be that it's invalid? So we'll in a minute we'll talk about that, and maybe that's why the Gemara doesn't want to learn it that way. In other words, it's not as automatic. You're trying to explain the case, and this seems to you as a very logical way of fitting the words with the case. But it could be the Gemara was more bothered with the logic behind it, that it's that the logic behind it doesn't really work that way if you learn it your way, and maybe that shouldn't be the halacha, and uh, and therefore the Gemara wanted to learn it this way. And in the end, the Gemara says, no, the other way seems to maybe fit better, and maybe it could fit with halacha. It's not a problem. So that would seemingly be the process that this Gemara is developed, the development of this Gemara, that's why it wants to learn one way, and then it changes. Then it says, no, we can learn it the other way. So if you want to say what you're saying, that it doesn't really fit so well the way we're explaining it, the reason why it would explain it that way is because maybe halachically that's the only way to explain it that would make sense. Do you get my answer, David?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that it doesn't mention the side. It doesn't mention that it's on its side in that
It
whole.
also doesn't mention that the other tefach is outside of the sukkah. It just says that that there's three tefachim in the sukkah. So it is vague. It's not like it expresses itself well. It's not like it communicates the case well. It's a it's a case that it doesn't say it so clearly what it is. So you could see it, you could see it different ways. Okay,
Rabbi,
so
Rabbi,
yes, Moshe, yes.
can I just, Rabbi Nachman, Rav Huna, the boards, if they're on, they have a different impact on this on as schach. I mean, because as if it's flat, it's different than if it's on its side. Meaning that if there's a wind, it could blow these boards down, making which would be reasonable to think that it's muscle. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Unless they're
Right.
using a
We spoke about
tzvachim,
this
the
yesterday. Yeah.
stones.
Yeah, we spoke about this yesterday, how you could have it in a way that it's more sturdy, because if it's unsturdy, then it might be not valid in the first place. The whole sukkah might be invalid. So we did talk about this yesterday. We said the different things you could make. Possibly you engraved in the in the frame of the sukkah that it would hold these boards. That's one simple answer. There's like grooves in the actual frame. You could have there are ways of making some type of contraption that holds it down. You put some heavy boards, or some heavy stuff on the sides. That would be that would lock it in. So we did talk about that problem yesterday. Okay, so anyway, the Gemara says that seemingly this is the case where you have it on its side, and it's going to be invalid. So Gemara says um, that would be a proof to Rav Huna. Gemara answers no, it's not a proof to Rav Huna, and the reason is because the case is talking about, as David wants to explain it, that the case is talking about that you put this board on the front of your sukkah. There's no wall there. So it's an entrance, the fourth wall of your sukkah, which basically is not a wall. It's a doorway, entirely open. And so you put this board there, and only 3 of the handbreadths are part of the sukkah, and the 4th handbreadth of this board is actually sticking beyond the sukkah. It's extending beyond the sukkah. Now, what is the halacha in this case? We're calling it puzzle. Why should it be puzzle in this case? Why would this be invalid? What would be the reason to invalidate such a sukkah?
So, well, you can't
Okay.
use Dofin Akuma. You can't use that because
Can't use
it's
Dofen Akuma
not next to the wall
next
anymore.
to a wall. This is next
So
to the entrance.
you can't write off part of it as part of the wall. So
Okay.
now the question is, what status does it have if it's not part of the wall?
Okay. But the question is different. What about the rest of the sukkah? Why is the rest of the sukkah not valid? I would think that the rest of the sukkah, at least, should be a nice, decent sukkah. And you have 3 walls with schach, kosher schach on top, and just don't go to the entrance area. And as long as you're in the regular, the other side of the sukkah, you should be fine. So why is this sukkah not good? So the answer to that question, anyone have an answer? Why should this sukkah not be good in such a case? So the answer to that question would be that we're talking about a very small sukkah. And if you have a very small sukkah, so you don't have the measurement that you need of a kosher sukkah anymore. Your measurement of a kosher sukkah has been diminished, and basically you've got some kosher schach there, but you don't have 7 handbreadths. So you got to imagine the sukkah to be a tiny sukkah, and because it's a tiny sukkah, you would need to count that those outer area, the at least the 3 handbreadths of the sukkah part, you would need to count that to make it 7 handbreadths. So we're saying that the sukkah doesn't have 7 handbreadths anymore, and so you don't have the minimum measurement of a sukkah. Okay, so we don't have the minimum measurement of a sukkah, and you have this board, and what are we going to say? That because of this extra tefach, this extra handbreadth, now it's going to ruin your sukkah. Why? Because if this board would only be 3 handbreadths, there would be no problem. The problem is that it's 4 handbreadths. If it would be 3, what would happen? It would be a kosher board. The problem is that it's 4. Because it's 4, now it's a non-kosher board, right? It's a non-kosher board, so it's invalidating your sukkah. But what do you mean? It's not even on the sukkah, all 4. Only 3 of them are on the sukkah. The 4th one is outside of the sukkah.
Yeah, but it's still there.
It's there, but do we need to count it and ruin the sukkah because of it? Not necessarily. You could say that, listen, I'm not allowed to use boards for schach when they're 4 handbreadths, but this
I'm only using 3.
I'm only using 3. So there's room to say that this shouldn't invalidate my sukkah. And to the extent, and I will take that a step further, there is a law called Pesel Hayotze or Psal Hayotze Min HaSukkah. Psal Hayotze Min HaSukkah means that if you have one wall that extends further on one side of your sukkah, so the schach that goes along that wall is actually considered to be a 2.5 wall kosher sukkah. What do you mean? I only have one wall going along this schach. Well, we consider it a continuation of your sukkah, and it's actually kosher to sit under. So, for example, if you have a sukkah shaped like a hangman, you have like a I don't know if there's any other better term, but you have like a long line, long wall, a medium-sized wall, and a tiny wall, you know. So that sukkah you could actually eat in the entire area because that whole sukkah is called psal hayotzim min sukkah. You have schach that's extending further from your sukkah. It's considered part of your sukkah as long as one wall is going along it. Now, our Gemara says that the reason why this is invalid, again, there's room to say that it should be valid because you're only using 3 of the handbreadths of this board. The other handbreadth is extending out of the sukkah. But because there's a law of psal hayotzim min sukkah that makes that the sukkah would be kosher if it was kosher schach extending. So we look at that non-kosher schach also as if it's part of your sukkah to invalidate your sukkah. So in other words, we're taking it both ways. We're saying if there's a rule of psal hayotzim min sukkah that will make it kosher, that rule also will apply to invalidate. Okay, now that sounds good. So now we have reason to say it's invalid. But let me ask you a question. What about in our case? In our case, if you think about the case, what do you have here? You have a sukkah that has kosher schach on it, but at the entrance of your sukkah, there's a long board, 4 handbreadths wide, and it extends over the entire front of your sukkah. 3 handbreadths are on top of your sukkah, and 1 handbreadth is going over your sukkah. Now, in this scenario, you do not have a wall that's extending with the schach. So if this would be psal hayotzim min sukkah to make it a kosher sukkah, you would need to have one of the walls extending. And here we're taking it a step further, at least according to some opinions, and there's not even an extra wall going along with this board, the extra tefach, the extra handbreadth of the board that's extending out of the sukkah. We don't have a wall that's extending with it, according to some opinions. And yet, we're still going to say that your sukkah is invalid. What do you mean? Psal hayotzim min sukkah is only if there's a wall extending with it. So here we're taking it, and what I'm mentioning is we're taking it a step further. And we're saying that even though psal hayotzim min sukkah would kosher that area and say it's valid, it's a good sukkah, even though you don't have 3 walls, you have 2.5 walls. But we look at it as if the walls are extended. The psal, it's the schach that extends. It's considered like it's a kosher sukkah, and as long as 1 wall goes along. Well, when it comes to invalidating, we will say that we're machmir, that even if there's no wall that goes along with it,
going to invalidate.
We consider it. We invalidate it. We consider it psal hayotzim. It's still part of your sukkah, and it's considered to be invalid. So we really are taking it a little extreme. Now, not everyone agrees with this, and the Pri Megadim argues and says that no, it must be talking about that there is a wall that's extending. That's why it's in, just like when the case to make it kosher, you need a wall, 1 wall is at least extending with the kosher schach. So the same thing would apply to our Gemara. Must be talking about that there's one of the walls is extending a little further along with this non-kosher board that's 4 handbreadths wide. It must be talking about that there is a wall going along with it, and that's why we're saying if it would be a kosher schach, it would be called psal hayotzim min sukkah, which would make it kosher. And now that it's a non-kosher board, and there's a wall going along, and we're going to say that it invalidates your sukkah. So that's the way the Pri Megadim learns. But there is another opinion that says that when it comes to passeling, to invalidating, we do take it a little more extreme, and we say that it invalidates your sukkah, even though it's extending beyond your sukkah, this extra tefach, this extra handbreadth. Now, based on this discussion, I think it answers David's question, and that is that the Gemara initially did not want to learn. The Gemara did not want to learn that that's the case. Why didn't the Gemara initially want to learn that the case is talking about that you have schach that is 3 hand breaths on your sukkah and 1 hand breath hanging, extending beyond your sukkah? Why didn't the Gemara initially want to understand the brisa that way? Seemingly because this is a quite innovative law. We're invalidating your sukkah because of an extra tefach that your board is extending beyond your sukkah. It's not even part of your sukkah, to the extent that, according to one way of looking at it, even if there's no wall going along with it, it's still going to invalidate your sukkah. Even if you don't even have any wall going along with this sal hayotzim in sukkah, with this, in this case, it's a board, with this board that's going out of your sukkah. Even there's no wall, it's still going to invalidate your sukkah. That's quite innovative to say. Listen, there's 2 ways of looking at it, but it's not automatic to say that this is invalid. And therefore, if the brisa is telling us that it's invalid, it would seemingly be easier to say that it's invalid because of the other scenario where it's standing upward, and in that case it's invalid because it's called shpudim shel matches. It's considered like metal, and it's considered, it would be invalid. Yes, Jeffrey.
So why do we say psul? Why don't we say letakanto or something like that, and cut off the 1 extra piece, one tefach. So now it would be flush with the space.
Right. Which makes sense that should work, right? Except that the Gemara really talks about your idea on first page of this tractate, where it says sometimes we give you the solution, how to fix it, and sometimes we don't. And why don't we give you the solution? And in our Mishnah on the first page, on page Beis Amud Aleph, right? And they had that discussion. And one of the answers there was that there are too many cases. And if it had to say the solution here, it would have to say a solution in the other places as well, And so that would be one of the answers there would apply here as well. Now, the issue, the point you're making, I guess, is the fact that this is a rabbinic problem, and if it's rabbinic, then there is room to say that it should give a takana, right? Like, why doesn't it give the solution?
Somebody's trying.
This?
He only has this wood, so he's trying very hard to figure out a way to use it,
right?
And that would be valid. So.
The only thing I would say is that not all the cases here are rabbinic law. Like, for example, the minimum size of a sukkah could be biblical, that biblically it has to be 7 by 7, or it's possible to explain the other cases that these are biblical problems, and therefore it's not only talking about cases that are rabbinic, and therefore it doesn't say the solution. So it would seem that it's not surprising that the Gemara doesn't give the solution. Okay, the Brisa doesn't give a solution how to fix it, and the other answer, I guess, would be also that it's pretty obvious that all you got to do is slice it. Maybe that's obvious, but then good question in the other cases, maybe it's also obvious. But okay, anyway, in any event, that's the conclusion of the Gemara, is that you have 1 hand breath that's sticking out beyond the sukkah, and the other 3 are in the sukkah, and therefore Therefore, it would be because it would basically ruin your sukkah because of that extra part. Now there is a discussion here in Rashi. Rashi wonders what would happen if this board was on the side. We mentioned that the board is in the front of the sukkah. What would happen if the board is on the side of the sukkah? So it's on with a wall. You have a board that's 4 handbreadths. Would it be invalid in that case? You have a board that's 4 handbreadths, but it's on the side. It's not in the front of your sukkah by the empty wall. It's by the side where you have a wall. And would that be a kosher sukkah or not? The Brisa talked about this case, and we're explaining it to mean it's on the empty. It's ancha pumad matalalta. It's on the Gemara's way of explaining it is that you specifically placed it on the mouth of the sukkah, and it's basically where there's no wall. But what would happen if you put it in a place where there was a wall? So what would be the din there? Would it then be kosher?
Because then you could use a dofen akuma.
Then you could use dofen akuma. So there it would seemingly be kosher, right? So Rashi says that that would be the reason why we're explaining it this way, because otherwise it would be dofen akuma. The problem with Rashi is, the question on Rashi is that I thought we're talking about a small sukkah. If we're talking about a small sukkah, maybe it won't be kosher with dofen akuma, because you have now taken away too much space from your sukkah. That if you're going to now call this you're going to call this a wall, it's going to be it's going to invalidate your sukkah because you don't have enough space of sukkah space. So the same way it's problematic in the front of your sukkah, it would be problematic on the side. Now, the answer to this question is that if there was a wall and this extended beyond the wall, then we would consider this sukkah a 3 handbreadth board, not a 4 handbreadth board, and we would actually say it's kosher. We would actually say it's kosher. So here you have like another example, a different example that actually changes the way you're thinking. In other words, it's sticking out of your sukkah, but we actually are not going to count that as part of your board, and we're going to say it really is going to be it's going to be a kosher, could be considered a kosher sukkah again, because the Gemara is following the logic. You have to keep in mind that what we are saying here, this Gemara's answer is basically saying we don't have to hold like Rav Huna, we could hold like the other opinions. Rav Huna was of the opinion that your board is considered metal. The Gemara's conclusion here is not necessarily. We could still consider your sukkah a kosher sukkah if, let's say, you had the boards flipped on the side. It might be a kosher sukkah, not like Rav Huna, but like the other opinions, because we're going to translate the Brisa differently. So it's still so that sukkah where it's flipped on the side, that will be a kosher sukkah. So we don't look at it like it's metal. We would consider it to be kosher. In that case, if you have a board that's partially on the sukkah partially over the wall of the sukkah, in that scenario, we aren't going to look at it like it's metal. We're going to say this is a kosher. This is kosher for schach, and therefore it would not be a problem of having of non-kosher it would not be an
Oh,
issue.
you're saying that
It wouldn't be an issue. The issue is really where it's in the front. That's where you would have an issue. But on the side, you wouldn't have such an issue because the wall would break it in half. The wall would make it considered that it's not part of that. It's not part of the same. It's not part of the sukkah again, and it would be fall under the category of doif and akuma. Rashi uses the term doif and akuma because what we're doing here is we're playing a little with that rule doif and akuma, and we're saying this wall is considered to split this board in half. It's a little play on this rule. In other words,
it's a double wall instead of a single wall.
Yeah, we're taking the outer part and saying it's considered or the inner part is considered like part of the wall, but not the outer part, and yet you can still sit under it. We're considering it part of the wall because only the inner part is really there, and we're allowing you to sit under it because the outer part is not part of that wall. So we're sort of using the law of Daifan Akuma to permit you even to sit under it. It is quite interesting based on this Rashi of how Rashi is explaining it. That it's
also
called Daifan Akuma.
It's also playing with the other idea. If you had two of those boards, that you have to consider like that together, like two sheets. So now you only have one of those boards. So even though it's sort of doubling the wall, consider that's okay. It's the opposite of two sheets considered to be together. Because they're not end on to end on. This one is considered to be like hanging over.
I'm not exactly sure your comparison. Again, the two sheet case was invalid schach that's right next to each other. Oh, so you're saying maybe the invalid schach on the outside of the sukkah should be considered to make it, yeah, but it's outside of the sukkah.
I understand. Yeah. But it's doubling the wall. There's already a wall there. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Anyway, it's an interesting halach. It's brought in the Magen Avram, this explanation. But in any event, so the Gemara does not conclude with any proof to Rav Huna or against Rav Huna. We could learn this brisa either way, and that concludes this Gemara, page 14. We're now on page 15a.